I guess we can get started then. Is that about that?
Actually, I'm really curious. Did you find the JSON and Solar interface super confusing as far as querying the API?
For Elasticsearch?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
The
So
question is, does Elasticsearch interface stop?
yes and no. Like there's the REST API part of it is actually really pretty simple. Like depending on how you set up your IDs and stuff. And then once you get into complicated stuff, the queries get really complicated. And then there's some sort of new and interesting bugs that come up every once in a while. So, basically what we've tried to do is really simplify things. And actually, that's what I'm going to talk about today. So by the way, I'm Olaf Alders. I want to talk to you about the MetaCPAN API and what other people have built with it and what you might be able to build with it. And so there was just a question about whether or not I think the interface sucks for Elasticsearch, which MetaCPAN is based on. And a little bit, yeah. But basically, there are some really easy things you can do with Elasticsearch, and then sometimes the syntax gets a bit crazy. So what we're going to do today are easy things, but I will show you a few ways that you can make a little bit more complex queries. What I want to do is just give you sort of enough rope to hang yourself, and then when you run into problems, I would suggest just come to the IRC channel. It's just MetaCPAN on irc.perl. And then we can help you from there. Like, there's generally always somebody just available to help you. So the architecture of MetaCPAN is it's built on top of Elasticsearch. We use Catalyst as a thin wrapper around it. The problem is you can't just let anybody run any kind of query on the Elasticsearch server. We don't want people running deletes or shutdowns or anything like that. So we built a little bit of a wrapper around it, and this is all stuff you really don't need to know. MetaCPAN's about 1.5 years old now. One of the cool things about it is that people started playing with it right away, partly because there wasn't really a web service around before that would let you do these sorts of things. And so I just want to show you, just to give you some ideas of what you might be able to build, what other people have already done with it. Now the first thing, the reason that I got involved with building MetaCPAN was I was working on an iOS application called iCPAN, and it was an offline document reader. And basically, I wanted to take all the documents in a mini CPAN and put them into an SQLite database, and then put this, which would be sort of the basis of this iOS application. But I found out it's actually really, really hard to do. It's just using modules that were on CPAN. It wasn't clear to me even where to find all the documentation inside each distribution. So I had to really jump through a lot of hoops to get this. And then what I found was, after doing all the work for iCPAN, it really would have been easier if there had been a web service to do this. So a bunch of us talked about it. We decided to build one. And then once that was available, it just seemed like it should be available to everyone. So this is iCPAN. Basically, you can just do searches. You can get module documentation, and you can bookmark your modules as well. There's now, as of a few weeks ago, you can actually, it looks decent on your iPad. There's also an Android app called CPAN Sidekick, which is actually probably even better looking than the iOS application. And this one, the difference between these two is that this actually isn't an offline reader. This one just interfaces with the API in real time and gets you what you need. So this one might be slower or won't work in the subway, but you'll get more up-to-date docs. This is one of my favorites, is GitHub meets CPAN, and it just creates a leaderboard out of your GitHub stats and your CPAN stats. Since day one, Miyagawa has been right at the top. That won't be changing anytime soon, I guess. But there's also this perlresume.org, which just is a kind of a neat way of displaying some of your data in more of a resume format. There's map of CPAN, which is a visualization of CPAN, based, again, all out of the MetaCPAN API. There's a couple of Chrome extensions. This one I actually just found about at the conference, and this one will take your search.cpan.org URLs and will rewrite them to MetaCPAN. So if you get them in a Google search, you'll actually just be directed straight to the MetaCPAN site. Just actually by show of hands, who's used the MetaCPAN search site to look for docs? Who uses it as their default search? Okay, and who's actually tried to build anything with the API? Two people. All right, excellent. There's also this MetaCPAN favorites report. This is kind of neat. It's a blog, but it uses aggregated stats for people that use the plus button on CPAN to give you an idea of what's popular this week, what's becoming more popular, that sort of thing. Then there's Perly Book, and it allows you to grab documentation for a module you're interested in, and then export it to a format that you can use on your phone. So this is kind of cool. You can actually just send it, say, straight to your Kindle app and get it on your devices as well. So this is, again, another form of offline reading. So, and there's also CPAN Doc, which is a drop-in replacement for Perl Doc. And what this allows you to do is actually run Perl Doc on documents that you haven't even installed. So that's actually, I thought, was a really interesting way of using it. Now, just for the purposes of our demonstration here today, I want to do something very simple. So I thought we could do something with the GitHub API and sort of create the basis of what you could use to make a Perl job site. So GitHub has a flag that you can set that indicates whether or not you're hireable. So we'll just get a list of CPAN authors whom we know have a GitHub ID, and we'll just check the GitHub API to see if we can hire these authors. So to get started, all we really need to do is get our data, and to do that, we're going to use Sawyer's MetaCPAN API, which you can find on CPAN as well. So the one thing I have to say here is that there actually are a lot of ways you can get stuff out of the API because it's just, you know, the API consumes and returns JSON, so you don't actually even need to use a module for this. You could use curl, you can use your browser. There's an elasticsearch.pm module that you can use as well. There's MetaCPAN API. There's a tiny version of this as well that only uses modules that are in core. But this is actually just a really easy way to get started, so I just want to focus on this and not get distracted by all the different ways you can do things. So this is basically, this is all you need to do to get the information about an author. Essentially, it's about 3 lines of code. You could do this in a one-liner if you want. So, you know, just the essential information is here. Just pass the author pause ID to the author method, and that's it. Now, if you dump this, you get something that looks a little bit like this. Now, I chose Matt Trout because he doesn't actually have a lot of information on his profile in MetaCPAN, so it was just a little bit easier to display here. But you'll see, you know, this is the directory of his CPAN modules. You can see the email here is actually an array, so you can put many more emails if you want. I've truncated the Gravatar URL just because it's just too long to display. Name, pause ID, website, that kind of stuff. So you can see that initially, just to get started, there's no overhead really in learning MetaCPAN. Now, just a bit of a background on the profile. When you log into MetaCPAN, when you get yourself an account, you can go and add all these various profiles. And the idea was if I'm interested in your modules, I don't want to have to go find where you are on Twitter or GitHub or things like that. I'd like to have it all in one place. And this is, so you can just go in here and add your authors. If you do, if you add your IDs, if you do this, just use this check button here as well, and that will validate whether or not you've actually entered the right information. Some people end up putting full URLs in here because we don't actually have proper validation. If anybody would like to add that, come talk to me afterwards. And then on your actual MetaCPAN profile here, you will see just these little icons that indicate what you've added. And in this case, I do have GitHub. And then the one other thing I wanted to point out to you is this MetaCPAN Explorer link that you'll always find on the bottom left. You'll find it on module pages, release pages, and author pages. And if you click on that, you'll actually get an idea of what the API returned to generate this page. So that actually, because sometimes you'll be on MetaCPAN and you'll be like, how do I get information about this thing? So just follow that link, and it'll give you something like this. And it'll show you the request path to the API up there, and then the response will be sort of nicely laid out here at the bottom. And then once you've messed around with that a bit, you could change the request. If you want to actually post things, you put them in this part. If you want to do a post request versus a get to the API, the button says get, but don't worry about that. And then there are also some examples up here of specific get and post requests to get started. So if you're just messing around, I'd say just go to MetaCPAN Explorer and just try these queries out. Just change them, just see what they can do. The best way to actually figure out what the API returns is just by examining the responses in this. So that's a great tool to have. So we started with Matt Trout. Let's see what happens when we just get some arbitrary author. So we're going to use the MetaCPAN module a little bit differently now. We're going to move from a get to a post request. Get requests are really easy, are good for really simple things. But if you want to do anything a little more complicated, just switch to the post. The syntax is going to be a lot cleaner. You won't end up jumping through hoops to try and get it done. So in this case, we're just saying, give me everything, and just give me one result. So that looks exactly like this. Now you'll see in this case the data structure that we got back has a lot of more technical information. It's got some Elasticsearch statistics with it, stuff that you generally don't care about. Unless there's an error, I would say you could probably ignore a lot of this stuff right here. What you care about is in hits. There's another key inside hits called hits again, no idea why. And then you want to go to underscore source, and that actually would have been, say, if this were a database, that would have been the row that it actually would have returned to you. And you can see in this case it's Kip Hampton, and as far as the profile information goes, that's an array with hashrefs inside of it, and each hashref has a key of ID and name, where the name is the name of the service, and the ID would be your username on that service. So all we really need to do is go through all the CPAN authors we're interested in, get the source part, and then iterate over the profiles until we find the GitHub name, and then extract the ID. So in this case, just to make it clear again, it's just result hits. We're going to grab the first result in the array and then print out the source, and that looks like that. So again, much cleaner to look at. Once you sort of scrape that junk out of the way, then you have a data structure that looks a lot more familiar. Now, let's change the size to 100 rather than just getting 1. Now we're going to get a little more complicated. There's no point in just grabbing every author because not all of them have added their their GitHub profile information. So we're going to add a filter now. So basically, all you need to know in this case is almost every time you want to do something, you want to use a filter rather than a query. That's basically all you need to remember. You will see some examples where people use queries, but filters are faster, and in general, you're just not going to need the query. So I don't really want to get too much into that stuff. So filter takes a term, and in this case, you're going to say author.profile.name and then Stack Overflow. This author dot part, if you're just querying on authors, is basically optional, but it's actually nice to be explicit about what you're looking for. It's probably a good habit to get into, but that's just a matter of taste. So basically, we're now going to say, give me the first 100 authors in the order you think is appropriate, who say they have a GitHub profile. And then once you get that information, then the interface part with the GitHub API is actually quite simple. So just use the PitHub module, create an object, and now we're going to iterate over this. So we talked about the result hits, and then for each author that we get in the hits array, we're going to get the source, and then we're going to iterate over the actual array ref of the profiles. Now, if the profile name equals GitHub, we're just going to do a quick transformation on the username. And again, and this is just goes back to the fact that some people are putting in actual URLs in their IDs. So we just need to make sure that after we've actually done all the stripping, that we have something. If we do, then it's just you use a PitHub object, call users, get the username, content gives you the hash ref, and then if hireable is true, then you could do something interesting. You can list them out, lay them out on a map, you can email them, whatever. So that's sort of basic stuff. Now if we want to get a bit fancier, let's just get authors who are in the United States. So that's easy. What we've done is we've added an and here, and we've added 2 terms to the and. Now you can even check for authors who have a region as well. So in this case, we want to put them on a map. I don't care about authors who haven't told me which state they live in. So I only want authors who have just basically anything in that field. Now, I don't want authors who also have a missing location field. And the location field is, you can sort of tell MetaCPAN to locate yourself, and it'll put your longitude and latitude coordinates in the API as well, which is really great for mapping stuff, and which actually hasn't been used yet. So that.
You're saying and if that's missing.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to give an example of missing. This probably doesn't make sense in this context, but I'm just trying to say you could say, if it has this, if it doesn't have this, and you can sort of and them together. It's sort of roughly analogous to what you might do with the database. And then, it's not just and, you can do ors as well. And in this case, probably results that don't make a lot of sense, but that is an option for you. Now, if you want to speed things up or you don't want to get a ton of data back from the API, you can just tell it which specific fields you want it to pass back to you. So that's kind of nice, especially when you're working with modules and releases that just have tons of information that they give you by default. You can also determine a sort order as well, which in a lot of cases you probably don't really care about. For a lot of these queries, if you're going to get multiple things, you probably just want to get everything that's in there, and just let Elasticsearch give it to you in the order that it wants to give you. But if you really care about the sorting, then you definitely can do that. So if you need help, like I was saying, you should come to MetaCPAN, to the IRC channel, and also there's a resources page which has links back to, say, the API documentation and that sort of thing. So that was sort of the basic stuff. Did anybody have any questions so far? Okay. What I want to, so there's a reference to the docs there, and then Clinton Gormley, who works with us, he's sort of our Elasticsearch expert, and he put together a great presentation called Terms of Endearment, where it explains the query DSL and sort of the difference between terms and a query itself. So I'd recommend you actually just take maybe 10 or 15 minutes to go through that if you're confused about any of the syntax and why things work like they do. Now, if you actually just want to hit the API directly, so this will be the URL that you use. We've got versioning in place. It does not do anything right now, but at some point it probably will, so you may just want to protect yourself and put in a version number in there. Now, what we've created are these convenience endpoints that make things actually really easy to get things out of the API. So if you want to get DOI's author information, just go to that base URL, add author/DOI, and then you'll get what you need. If you want to get something on the Moose distribution, just use this URL. And the distribution sort of just gives you information that's specific to all the releases that are within a distribution. So in this case, it doesn't give you much yet, but it will give you, say, the open number of RT tickets or GitHub issues for a specific distribution. If you want to get info about the latest Moose release, just use this URL, the latest moose.pm, and the pod for the latest moose.pm. So one thing to note is that we have all of CPAN in MetaCPAN, and we have all of BackPAN as well. So that's why we created these endpoints, so that you only get the very latest and the very latest authorized version of anything when you use these URLs. And then if this were a relational database, which is not, this is sort of how the hierarchy works. We say that an author has many distributions, a distribution has many different releases, a release has many modules, and a module might have pod. So that's sort of the way to think about it. Now, one of the neat things about pod is, and pod sort of works nicely into applications that you're using, is that we can save you the effort of having to go and do something with the pod or having to render it in a different format. If you pass a content type parameter or a content type header, you can get your pod in HTML, which is a default, or plain text, or actually just extract the pod itself out of a module, or you can get it in Markdown. And we're open to adding other formats as well, but these are sort of the easy ones to get started with. Now, if you do have to dig down really deep into the API, these are the actual endpoints. These ones, you can access them directly, and they don't have any kind of sugar around them, like as far as that stuff goes. There's an author distribution, which we've already talked about, but these ones you can use to directly search on. And in fact, this is the endpoint we were using in the example that I gave you before. Once we did the actual search, it actually just hit this endpoint. Favorites, and that will be the list of, say, when somebody clicks the ++ button, that is entered as an entry into the favorites. Ratings is what we've extracted out of the CPAN ratings. Release again, and then you've got file. You notice that module is missing. Module is really just a special type of file. If you want to do sort of complex queries, you would search on files and then tell them, you're looking for something that's been authorized and has pod and that sort of thing. And then again, so the real endpoints look very similar to the other scheme. Author has many distributions. A distribution has many favorites and many ratings. It also has many releases. Releases have files now, and a file might have pod. Yeah. No, not yet. There's an outstanding issue for somebody if somebody wants to look at it, but we don't. I mean, potentially we could. There's still lots of room for us to do this. We keep everything in RAM. We've got about, I think, 35 gigs of RAM to work with, and I think right now we're maybe using 22 or 24. So there's still room for lots of data that we can work with. But a lot of this stuff. It's really just down to somebody volunteering and taking the time to do it. So there's a fairly small group of people that make regular commits, and we're always looking for people who just want to pitch in. It's not a lifelong time commitment, you can just come in and patch something and leave. But definitely a lot of this stuff it's not there just because somebody hasn't done it yet. If you want to speed things up, you can use some caching. So when you create your MetaCPAN object here, you can just give it an arbitrary user agent, and in this case, you can make sure that this user agent uses mechanized cached. If you want to go with the default settings, that's fine to get started with. If you want some more complex caching, you can do that as well. And what's great about this is if you're grabbing big sets of information, when you're running it 10 or 20 times after the first time, it's quite fast. And also if you're on an airplane or something like that, you need to rerun these queries, then you've got no problem at all. Now, if you want to go really hardcore, you can actually look at the Elasticsearch mappings. You can tell by looking at them, they're not really pleasant to look at. It's really more for troubleshooting, say what say the author type can give you. So I'm just sort of making you aware that it is here. It's kind of helpful to know, but just for getting started, it's usually not what you want. You can also enable compression either by using one of these user agents or sending the appropriate request header with your response, or sorry, the header with your request. And the last thing is there's also a scrolling API. So if you want to get, let's say, 80,000 documents, the polite thing to do is use this Elasticsearch scrolling API where you get an ID back with every response, and then on the subsequent request, you'll pass that ID back, and it will help you iterate over the results. So we've tried our best to sort of defend against bad behavior, but every once in a while, things might cause a higher load on the server, but using something like the scrolling API should mitigate that. So that's basically sort of enough, I think, to get you started. So again, we sort of went into the author stuff in depth, but there's lots of other cool stuff that you can do just with release and module information, and especially with the favorites. I can see a lot of uses for that. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So the MetaCPAN has backend as well.
Yeah.
Is it actually indexing back? Like
Yeah.
creating CPAN-like interface for backend?
Well, when you're going through the search site, you can view documentation for anything that's on Backpan as well.
Okay.
So let me just see here. So let's just. Well, actually, you can basically everything's in one big folder, like one big directory. So if you want to install stuff from Backpan, you could use the CPAN mirror as well for that. Okay, no, it should all still be there together, and you can see that you can just go back to all these really old versions of things, and then also some people just aren't aware that you can do version diffs as well on MetaCPAN. So you can do a diff of a particular file or do a diff of a whole distribution, which is actually quite handy when you want to find out where things broke. Anybody else? All right, thanks very much.
I have question. But when I'm often doing search in CPAN for something that does something, and that will come up with 10 options. Trying to figure out the best way. This is more of like maybe a community question, but the best way to determine like what is most popular, what is most often used.